Hello everyone, Stormy Strike here, and welcome to my annual BreyerFest Surprise Horse Speculation video. In this video, I'll be discussing and speculating what the BreyerFest 2021 Surprise Horse Special Run model will look like. This includes both what colors it might come in and what mold it might be. Before we begin, a special shout out to this video's sponsor, Bend, Break, and Recreate. They are a new YouTube channel that posts awesome videos about how to customize model horses. With this year's upcoming BreyerFest all about art and contests, like the BreyerFest Diorama Contest, now is a great time to learn how to customize model horses and get inspiration for your own creations. Right now, Bend, Break, and Recreate have 2 videos about creating your very own Pegasus model, and 1 video on how to make an awesome looking barn for your models. I will be linking their channel in the video description down below, so be sure to check them out. Now let's get to talking about the BreyerFest Surprise model. Remember that I do not currently work for Breyer, and I do not actually know what the Surprise Horse model is going to be. All my guesses and theories in this video are based on public information and patterns from past BreyerFests. Since BreyerFest is virtual this year, and there are a lot of newcomers to BreyerFest, before we dive too deep into talking about these colors and molds that the surprise model could be, I do want to give a little background on this type of speculation video I do. In 2015, I started a series of videos where I try to guess what the upcoming BreyerFest Surprise Horse model might be. In 2015, I actually got my top guess correct, and then I got it right again in 2018. So far, those are the only 2 years where my top guess was correct, but in those other years where my number 1 guess was not the right one, I did have the right mold listed in my other top 10 guesses. There was one exception, however. For BreyerFest 2017, I did not at all have the Latigo mold on my list of guesses. These speculation videos are definitely not always going to be spot on. Sometimes I will get it right, or usually I will have that mold that ends up being the surprise model somewhere in my list of top 10. Regardless, these videos are just really fun to try and figure out what the surprise model could be, whether or not I actually end up getting the correct guess in the end. Normally I do these surprise horse speculation videos later in the year, closer to BreyerFest, typically around June. But this year I am doing this video so much earlier due to Breyer revealing the majority of their BreyerFest models early. It is very likely that Breyer will come out with some new models between now and BreyerFest that will even eliminate molds off of my top 10 list of guesses. Pretty much any new models that Breyer reveals for either BreyerFest, the Collector Club, other clubs, or mid-year releases could possibly affect my list of guesses, so it's very possible that this list may change quite a bit by the time we get to BreyerFest. If that is the case, that a bunch of models might come out before BreyerFest that will end up drastically changing my list of top guesses, then I will do a follow-up video to this one closer to BreyerFest where I may change my guesses. This year's BreyerFest Surprise Horse is called the 7 Arts Surprise. As usual, Breyer doesn't outright reveal anything about this model, but there are things to talk about in regards to the original posts they did about it. Breyer said, "We can't reveal this mold to you just yet. We can't even give you so much as a clue. What we can reveal is that we have pulled out all the stops for this year's surprise model, the 7 Arts Surprise. There will be a total of 6,000 of this model made, and each will cost $85, but that's all we'll say. The 7 Arts refers to the traditional subdivision of the arts: architecture, sculpture, painting, literature, music, performing arts, and film. Here's to a beautiful and creative 2021. Now, I know Breyer said that they can't give us a clue about this model, but there is a lot of possible hints and speculation from this post, along with the name of the model and the logo for this surprise model. I've heard tons of theories and ideas on what this could all mean, and I will be talking about some of these throughout this video. Some of the main points of interest I've noticed are, of course, the name of the surprise, which has a number in it. That is something that surprise models have never had before. There's never been a number in their name. Even the logo for the surprise shows these 7 different colors, and they talk about these 7 different subdivisions of the arts. Most of these possible hints pertain to the number of surprise models and their colors, which typically when I do these surprise speculation videos, I talk about the colors at the very end. But for this video, I'm actually going to be talking about the colors first before we dive into talking about what the mold could be. The big main theory this year is that there will be 7 different color variations for the Surprise model. Now, Breyer has done up to 6 color variations for the Surprise model once before in 2019, so that's not too far-fetched of an idea that they could do 7 this year. Last year, Breyer reined it in, as I believe they put it, on the Surprise model, and they only did 4 color variations. Maybe they will be doing a lot of colors this year to partially make up for temporarily changing back to those only 4 variations. We can also take into consideration the quantity of Surprise models that are being made this year, along with Breyer saying they have pulled out all the stops for this Surprise. That does support the possibility that there will be 7 color variations. Now, there is a variety of possibilities as to how these 7 colors could be incorporated into this model's run. For example, it could be possible that maybe there are, say, 4 realistic colored models, and then 3 of those have rare decorator variations. Or maybe they'll go their more traditional route with the Surprise models and do something like 6 realistic colored models and then 1 decorator. But maybe a couple of those realistic colored ones are a little bit rarer than the others. There could be a lot of possibilities, but I would really be surprised if they didn't somehow incorporate the number 7 into these Surprise models, considering that the number 7 is in the model's name. It'd be kind of crazy if they didn't have 7 incorporated just somewhere with those Surprise models. Another theory, which I have also heard someone else speculate on, is that what if Breyer didn't do 1 mold this year for the Surprise, but did a couple molds, or 7 different molds? This is a crazy theory, and in some ways I think it would be really cool. But overall, I don't think Breyer would do this from a production perspective. I feel like something like that would be a little tricky to manage, plus the Surprise models would be different shapes in their packages if that was true, if they had different molds. Then one mold is going to be a bit of a different shape than the other one, even when it's bubble wrapped. Now, that's not really a problem when Breyer releases models only online, but having different molds would be a bit more of a problem at in-person BreyerFest because you could guess pretty quickly which mold you had. Now, you may be thinking, but wait, BreyerFest is online this year. And yes, while it is online this year, Breyer didn't make the announcement that they were 100% doing it online until January this year. I think it takes them quite a long time to design these models, and I believe they were probably working on them still last year before they knew they were going to be doing it online only or not. So the idea of the Surprise model being on several different molds is a really fun idea. I don't think it's very likely. Now let's talk more about the colors for this model. I've heard some people speculate that all the models would be decorators. I do highly doubt that theory as well. I think there will be at least 1 decorator in the mix, but there will more likely still be more realistic colored models than decorators. And this is because decorators are generally not as popular as the realistic colored models. And I think Breyer knows this, so I don't think they will ever do a Surprise model that has only decorator models in it. Maybe someday decorators do become so popular that they'd want to do that. But right now, I think there's definitely going to be some realistic colored models in with the Surprise model this year. I do want to talk about the fun idea of what if the colors on the Surprise logo correlate with the 7 different color variations on the Surprise model. Based on this idea, I'm going to go ahead and give my speculation on what horse color each of these paint strokes could match up with. For example, first is blue. Now this could represent a blue roan. The second one is a pretty bright teal, which I think teal is a little bit harder to match up with a realistic horse color, which is why I'd like to think that maybe this color would represent the decorator. Maybe we'll get a blue colored decorator, or at least a decorator that has a lot of blue incorporated with it. The third paint stroke is a pale pink. Now this could match up with a rose gray. Rose gray horses and models do look rather pink, so this shade of pink definitely makes me think of a rose gray, so maybe that would be like a rose gray color we could expect. This fourth one is an olive color, which I think would match up nicely with a Gruyot colored model. Number 5 is a very bright yellow, which makes me think of some kind of dilute colored horse, possibly a palomino or buckskin, or maybe even another cream or pearl colored model. The sixth one is a little tricky because it is yet another blue, but this is a less saturated blue, which makes me think maybe this could be for a dappled gray model. Dappled grays can sometimes look a tad blue, so maybe that's what this color could be representing. And then the final one is a bright orange, which makes me think of a very fiery chestnut. So that's my own color speculation based on these paint strokes. I don't believe these would all be solid colored models. I'm sure there are Pintos and Appaloosas mixed in there too. Maybe even a brindle, one could hope. I don't know if Breyer would be so obvious as to post all the different colors that the surprise model is going to come in the logo like that, but it's a fun little speculation. There is another theory about color for the surprise models, and that is that each of their colors will correspond to the 7 traditional subdivisions of the arts. And honestly, that wouldn't really surprise me if they did that too, because so far all of their models, except for the portrait models, have been heavily inspired by different artworks, art movements, or artists. Therefore, I could definitely see each of these art forms relating to each color variation in some way, or maybe relating to the patterns on the horses. For example, maybe they'll do an Appaloosa to represent music, because Appaloosa spots kind of look like music notes. Or maybe there will be a Pinto pattern with subtle shapes that kind of look like buildings or architecture. Maybe the decorator model will look like paint splatters to represent painting. Maybe to represent film, one of the models will look very similar to a famous horse that was on film, like Trigger, for example. Or maybe the horse for film could actually be a dappled gray to represent the silver screen. Another idea is that maybe the decorator model, or one of the decorator models, for the surprise horse is some kind of fantasy model. Fantasy horses have been in art for centuries. You could totally see them deciding to throw a more fantastical fantasy-like horse in there. There are just so many different possibilities, and then sometimes I go overboard on coming up with these ideas of what these models could look like, and then I get a little disappointed when the actual surprise horse colors come out, because sometimes they aren't nearly as exciting. But part of the fun of these videos is coming up with all of these crazy ideas on what could be done on the surprise model. I am really hoping that they do some really fun, crazy colors with these models. They did say that they are pulling out all the stops, so I really hope that's true, and that we'll see some really cool colors. Now let's move on to the discussion of what the surprise horse mold could be. This year's surprise mold is going to be very difficult to figure out because the horse of a different color theme really opens it up to a lot of possibilities. It's not like in some previous years where we anticipate a stock horse for a more Western themed BreyerFest, or we don't think it's going to be a stock horse because it's a Celtic themed BreyerFest. But this year they can really use any mold and it would fit with the BreyerFest theme. If you are new to my BreyerFest speculation videos or just need a refresher from my previous years, I do my guesses based on Breyer and BreyerFest patterns. There are these kind of certain rules, you could say, that the surprise horse mold typically falls under. These aren't official hard and fast rules. Breyer can technically do whatever they want, but in the past several years of the surprise model, the molds typically follow these certain parameters. Here are the surprise horse quote-unquote rules based on previous patterns. The surprise horse mold will likely not be a mold that's already been a surprise model, being used as a BreyerFest model this year, been used as a special run or store special last year, been used recently within roughly the 6 months leading up to BreyerFest, is a vintage or widely unpopular mold. Vintage is technically now considered anything that was made before 2001, but it's possible that some late 90s molds could still be used. And then there are some additional points to take into account. The surprise mold often, but not always, coincides with the BreyerFest theme, is at least 3 years old, is a modern popular mold, has had a recent, but not too recent, release on the mold. This means roughly 6 to 18 months before BreyerFest. And the surprise mold often, but not always, falls under the live auction pattern, which means that it was used as a live auction model the previous BreyerFest year. There were less live auction models last year in 2020 than there usually are, which does bring up the speculation of if there would have been more if BreyerFest was in person last year. This could mean that there are some molds out there that would have technically fallen into the live auction pattern, but we wouldn't know because they didn't actually have those models in the live auction. So that's kind of a tricky situation on whether that live auction pattern will really come into play this year or not. So far it has been pretty consistent, and of course the one year that I really took this pattern into account, the mold did not actually fall into that pattern. How this next part of my speculation video works is I'm going to run through the entire list of molds on identifyyourbreyer.com with you guys, and I'll mark each mold depending on how likely I think it will be used. I have 4 different ways that I mark the molds. If I use a red X over the mold, that means that there is some reason that makes this model a near definite that it won't be used. Usually I only use red X's on the molds that have already been surprise models, or they are models that are currently being used as BreyerFest models this year. The next type of mark is a gray X. This is for molds that are highly unlikely for other reasons, usually because they are a vintage mold or were used as a BreyerFest model last year. Then there is the green box. I use a green box over the molds that I think have a pretty good possibility of being the surprise model, especially if there's nothing that really restricts them from being used. Lastly, I will sometimes also not give a mold any marks, and that means that model just kind of falls between being a strong possibility and probably not being a possibility. Usually with these molds, there just might be something that's holding them back from me marking them down as a strong possibility as being the surprise model. Alright, now let's get started. On this first page, I did not mark down any molds as being a super high possibility. I would have had the American Saddlebred Stallion as one of them, but he is going to be a flagship dealer model this year. And I didn't do the Mangala Marchador just because I feel like he's not popular enough. Maybe Breyer knows this, so I don't know if they would use him as a surprise model or not. On page 2, the Arabian Mare is a pretty good possibility. I've actually had her on my list of possible molds several times in the past. This mare does have several different head, neck, and tail options, so it would be neat with the surprise model if they did utilize those different head and neck and tail options to give some different combinations and variety in the surprise model. On page 3, Forever Siege or the Mustang Mare is being used as a regular run this year, which is why I did not include her as a very strong possibility to be used. But one mold that is a possibility here is the National Show Horse, or also known as Rejoice. This mold hasn't been used in a while. It actually hasn't been used since 2017. I could see her possibly being the surprise model. I do think she's got kind of an artsy vibe to her. I think she'd fit the theme pretty well. Then we have Dundee, who I almost didn't put down as a possibility because while they haven't used him yet in 2021, he was used 3 times in 2020 as a Collector Club Web Special, regular run, and Seattle Soul Race Special run. He is also a pretty new mold, so while he is a possibility, I have been debating whether how much of a possibility he would be based on the fact he's been used so much recently. On to page number 4. Now, the Big Ben mold is technically possible, but I don't think he's overly well loved enough for them to use him. And he is getting definitely on the older side, so I kind of doubt they'd use him as a surprise model. Bluegrass Bandit, however, is a very strong possibility. She was used as a live auction model in last year's BreyerFest. If you want to take that live auction pattern into account, then that would definitely mean that she would be a pretty strong possibility. And there's also a unique thing about this mold, which is that she was actually sculpted by 2 Breyer artists. I think that'd be kind of neat if they used her, since that kind of furthers the idea of art and community that this year's BreyerFest theme has been focusing on. On to page number 5, there's actually not really any molds here I think are a very strong possibility. The Racking Saddlebred Stallion or Hamilton mold would be an awesome surprise horse, but he is being used as a Collector Club Web Special right now, and he was also a raffle model for last year's BreyerFest, so I'm not so sure that they would use him yet. On to page number 6. Cigar is a possibility. He's actually another one of those molds that I've included on my list of possibilities several times now. However, I'm not feeling very strongly about him being used as a surprise model this year. While he doesn't really have anything stopping him from being the surprise, I just don't really feel that he'd be used this year. I almost put Rain down as a possibility, but she's just really not popular enough, I don't think. I almost put her on the list just for the fact that she is connected to art. Her mold and the Spirit mold actually technically incorporate a bunch of different mediums because they are based after hand-drawn animation, they're based after film, and technically also digital animation, and then of course sculpture. So while I think she would be really cool to be used as a surprise model, I don't think they would use her just on the fact that she is not very popular. I do have the Cleveland Bay model marked down as a possibility. It has technically been enough time now from when he was used as the 2019 celebration horse for BreyerFest that he could come back and become a surprise model. He was also used as a live auction model in 2020, which again would put him into that live auction pattern. This model does also have some different mane and tail combinations, which is another fun thing that they could utilize with the surprise horse. Then there's the Connemara mare. This is another good possibility. She came out in 2014, which is plenty of time for her mold to no longer be considered too new. She was last used as a 2020 regular run. Lastly on this page, I also have Ruffian marked down. I'm actually not really feeling that she's going to be the surprise this year. There's nothing really preventing her from being it. I just kind of don't feel like it would be her this year, but who knows. She is a really awesome mold, and she does also have 2 different tail combinations. On page 7, there's actually 2 molds I marked down as being pretty good possibilities, which are Desatado and Salinero. Neither of these 2 molds have too much holding them back from being the surprise model. There is actually one thing each of them do have that kind of makes them not be my top guesses, but I'll be talking about that later on in this video. On to page 8, there's only one that I think is a pretty good possibility, and that is the Shegia Arabian, aka the Yasmin mold. I feel like this one also has a fairly good chance at being the surprise model. On to page number 9. I actually did have the silver mold on here originally and even had him in my top 10 list, but then Breyer came out with a web special on this mold, so I had to remove him as a possibility and partially redo this video. I do have Smart Chicolina marked as a good possibility. He has had some recent releases. Breyer tends to like using this mold a lot, so I wouldn't be surprised if he did end up being the surprise, but I also don't have too strong of a feeling about him being used. The fact that Breyer does seem to like using this mold so much, though, makes me think it could also be a possibility that they'll use him as a surprise model regardless. On page 10, Goffert doesn't really have anything that would prevent it from being used. I don't know if I really feel like they'd use it this year, but who knows, I could still see them using this model as a surprise horse this year. I also have marked down Emerson and the Spanish Stallion. I actually share the same feelings on these 2 molds. They are both fairly new molds, but they are also both reaching the point where they're not too new that Breyer wouldn't use them as a surprise model. The Spanish Stallion, or Duende, is actually being used as the 2021 holiday horse, so I'm kind of thinking he might not end up being the surprise because of that. But Breyer has come out with models on the same mold as the surprise horse fairly soon after the surprise model, so it is still possible. And for the Spirit model, I feel the same way as I do about him with Rain. I think he would be a really cool surprise horse model, especially for this theme, but he's just not very popular because of how cartoony he looks. On to page 11, I do have one possibility, which is the Huckleberry Bay mold. Now, he hasn't been used since 2018, but he is one of those staple molds for showing Breyer artistry. In a lot of Breyer catalogs or the backs of Breyer boxes, they show some of the processes of creating models, and one of the molds they use sometimes is the Huckleberry Bay mold. I think it would be kind of neat then if they did use him as a surprise model, since he is such a staple for the Breyer brand in general, and for how these amazing models are created. Secession is almost a possibility, but I just really don't see this model being used without her foal. While Breyer does tend to break up mare and foal pairs a lot, like for example last year's with Giselle, they don't release Secession without a foal usually, so I kind of don't see her being used as a surprise. On page 12, Kennebec Count is another one that technically be a possibility, but I really just don't think he's popular enough for Breyer to use him. On the other side of this page, though, there's quite a few molds. Totalis is a pretty strong possibility. He's actually been on my list of possible surprise models several times now. He was most recently a mid-year release regular run in 2020, which still qualifies him for being a surprise model this year. Weather Girl is a possibility. She was used as a BreyerFest special run in 2019, but that is enough time for them to use her as a special run model again. There is, however, the question of would they ever use molds that were previously treasure hunt models as surprise horses, but I think considering how old the treasure hunt events are becoming, my guess is that they probably would still use them regardless of that. The Walking Thoroughbred is a possibility, but not a very strong one in my eyes. The same kind of goes for Idicus or the Warmblood Stallion. He was used as a Seattle Soleil special run in 2020 and a Collector Club model in 2019, but otherwise he's not been used a huge amount. I feel like he's another one of those models that is often on my list of possible surprise horse molds. And he's also another one that has those different mane and tail combos, which would be very fun to include in a surprise horse model. We're getting towards the end now with page 13. On here I did mark down the Lipizzaner mare. I don't have a super strong feeling that she'd be the surprise. This mold actually feels like it's been used quite a bit already, even though it's a fairly young mold. I don't know if they would use her quite yet, but she is a very pretty mold, I think. On to page 14, the final page. And on here there are two that I marked down, which include Bobby Joe, or the working cow horse mold. This is a pretty popular mold, and while she still feels really new to me, she's actually over 5 years old now, so she is definitely old enough that they could use her as a surprise model. And lastly, I put down Zippo Pine Bar. For Zippo Pine Bar, I went ahead and marked him as a possibility, as he does have several things that increase his chances, but there's one thing that significantly lowers his chances, and that is that he is one of the molds that the Collector Club members voted on last year for which mold his color should be for the 2021 Collector Club model. I feel like that does make him less likely because regardless of whether or not he wins the vote to be the Collector Club model for 2021, this particular Collector Club voted model tends to be released not too long before BreyerFest, like usually around April or so. So I don't think he is as likely. I don't believe I mentioned this earlier, but the same is also for the Walking Thoroughbred. Both of these molds, I kind of ended up marking them down as possibilities, but really thinking about it, they're kind of a little bit more towards not being as possible. Now we've actually went through all of the different molds, so I'm going to go ahead and list out all of the ones I marked down as fairly strong possibilities. And those molds are the Arabian Mare, National Show Horse, Dundee, Bluegrass Bandit, Cigar, Cleveland Bay, Connemara Mare, Ruffian, Destado, Salinero, Shaggy Arabian, Smart Chicolina, Goffert, Standing Thoroughbred, Totalis, Huckleberry Bay, Trotting Arabian Mare, Walking Thoroughbred, Warmblood Stallion, Lipizzaner Mare, Bobby Joe, and Zippo Pine Bar. That's 22 molds in total, which is a lot of molds, and it is tough to narrow that list down. Which is why this year I'm really going to be leaning on a pattern I haven't talked much about before in previous surprise horse speculation videos, but it is a pattern that seems to be pretty spot on. And the pattern is that a mold has been released within roughly about 2 years before the BreyerFest it becomes a surprise model. Now it also can't have been released too soon, as I've mentioned earlier. For example, if Breyer comes out with a model on that mold a couple months before BreyerFest, that's kind of too soon for it to be used again as the BreyerFest Surprise model. But if the mold was released about a year ago from BreyerFest, then that actually has a better chance of being the surprise model. Or if it's a regular run model that's been running for a while and it is still currently being made, that can also count. I did make this little chart thing in my notes when trying to figure out the surprise model, and I will throw it up on screen for you guys to view. In this chart I have all the BreyerFest years listed, the mold that was used for the surprise model, and then the year and the name of the model that was released prior to that surprise horse model. There are only 2 surprise models that didn't quite follow this pattern. Nakota is one of them because while he did have 2 releases in 2013, they were both BreyerFest releases. He was an early bird raffle model, which there are only 3 of, and a crystal model, which obviously wasn't run in plastic. So that was kind of a weird exception on him, I guess. The other odd one is Esprit because he didn't have any releases in 2015, the year prior to him being the surprise. However, he did have a few releases in 2014. Therefore, I will be using this particular production pattern to help me narrow down this list of models into a little bit shorter list of 10 models. Another factor I'll be using to help me decide on my guesses for the surprise horse model is the model's breed type. I've noticed a pattern with these surprise models where they tend to not repeat the same breed type the following year. The exception to that has again been Nakota. He is a stock horse type mold, and he followed the release of Roxy, who is also a stock horse type, but otherwise the breed types for the surprise models have not been the same 2 years in a row. Last year's 2020 surprise model was a warm blood, which leads me to believe that it is less likely that the surprise will be a warm blood again this year. I will of course be using some other factors as well while determining my top 10 list. Note that even using these certain patterns and quote-unquote rules about the surprise mold, it is still really hard for me to narrow down the list of possibilities because there are just a lot of molds that are in the range of possibility this year. And actually, by the time I got the list down to my top 15 guesses, it was still really hard to try and figure out which ones would make it to the top 10 list. So before we go through the top 10, I want to mention 4 molds for quick honorable mentions. They are the Cleveland Bay, the Lipizzaner Mare, the Standing Thoroughbred, and Goffert. All of these molds were close to making it to my top 10 list, but they just didn't quite make it. Without further ado, my top 10 guesses for the BreyerFest 7 Arts Surprise model. Number 10. Totalis, or Totalis, however you say them, I still don't know. This mold does have the disadvantage of being a warm blood, like the previous Surprise Horse model. However, it is currently being used in production. I think it would make a good mold for the Surprise Horse. I have had this mold in my list of top guesses for the Surprise Horse in the past, and it is back once again. Number 9. Warm Blood Stallion or Idicus. This mold also has the problem of being a warm blood, which might mean it is less likely to be used this year, but this mold does have the really fun factor of having those 2 different mane and tail combinations, which do make it a fun possibility for the surprise model. I'd love to see both loose and braided mane versions of this mold used for the surprise. Maybe even that swishy tail version they used that one time. Overall, this mold also feels pretty well loved. I could definitely see them using him as a surprise model, if not this year, then maybe some other year. Number 8. Connemara Mare. This plucky little pony is one I think is very possible to appear as the surprise model. The only reason I didn't place her any higher on this list is because the stablemate version of her is being used as a Gambler's Choice model in the Stablemate Club this year. And that Gambler's Choice model is typically released around summertime, so I think that may affect her use as a surprise model. She is an adorable mold with other great reasons to be used, however. A pony mold has only been used as a surprise model once before in 2012. I feel like it's only a matter of time until they end up using a pony mold again. This particular mold also just kind of feels very artsy to me. She feels like a good model for the BreyerFest theme. Number 7. Desatado. This mold would have been higher up on my list, but it does have one tiny setback, which is that it hasn't been in production super recently. The last time it was used was in 2019 for a limited edition decorator model. Now 2019 isn't that super long ago, but it is something I took in consideration when trying to rank these models. It is possible that it is a little less likely since it was used around mid-2019 and not later in 2019 or in 2020. However, this is a mold that I think would just make a really good surprise model at some point. He's been around since 2012, but he hasn't had a ton of releases since then. There are a ton of colors that haven't been explored on this mold yet that I think would be super cool to see being used on him as a surprise model. Number 6. Arabian Mare. Here's another mold that has made appearances on my list of surprise guesses before, the Arabian Mare, or as you might also know her, Oasis, Make-A-Wish, S Just a Dream. She has a ton of different names that people like to refer to her as. This is another mold that has the fun possibility of using different mane and tail combinations, and not just that, but those different head and neck options too. This mold has 3 different tail variations and 3 different head and neck / mane variations, which could lead to a lot of different combinations. And with the possibility of there being 7 different surprise model variations, now would be a good time to utilize all those different combinations. This mold also has the benefit of being in production recently and being a rather popular mold. I feel like she's not quite as popular now as she once was, but she is still pretty popular. I almost put this mare even higher up on this list, but the one thing that stopped me is the fact that if they do those different head and neck combinations, those will be pretty easy to tell the difference of when the model is in the bubble-wrapped packaging. Regardless, they could just pick one of the head and neck options for this mare instead of trying to do all the different combinations, which is why she is still fairly high up on this list. Number 5. Salinero. The main reason Salinero made it as high onto this list is mostly just because he does follow the live auction pattern. The mold has been in production recently, but also hasn't been overused too much either. This mold has actually been in my top guesses for BreyerFest Surprise models a few times now, and I bet I will eventually be right. I mean, I did have Giselle in my list of top guesses for the surprise model several times, and then she eventually ended up being the surprise model last year. So who knows, maybe this guy will eventually be a surprise model. However, I didn't put this model higher up on my list because he is a warm blood. Number 4. Shagia Arabian, aka Yasmin. At first, when I was looking at the list of possible molds, I wasn't going to rank this mare very high up on the list, but then the more I look and think about her, I could definitely see her being the surprise model more and more. I surprised myself by putting her this high on this list actually, but there's nothing really stopping them from using this mold. They did a release of her in 2020, 2 releases technically. Her mold is new, but not too new. I think she is generally well liked. I'd say she's not the most popular mold, but I think overall she's pretty popular. They have done this mold as a gelding before too, so they could technically make this mold a gelding or a mare for the surprise. This mold has also had a unicorn release, which means maybe the decorator could be a unicorn of some sort. I actually really like this mold, so I would love to see her as a surprise model someday. I feel like any color, loud or subtle, just looks really good on her. Although I do wonder what a crazy decorator color would look like on her. I bet it would still look pretty amazing. Now for my top 3 guesses. All 3 of these molds were pretty neck and neck when I was trying to decide in which order to put them in this list. I seriously have moved these 3 molds around in my top 3 list multiple times now when working on this video because they all have really good reasons to be the surprise model, and I honestly have really good feelings about all 3 of them. My top number 3 guess is Dundee. So far as making this video, there isn't a lot of stock horse representation in this year's BreyerFest, which makes me lean towards the possibility that a stock horse mold will be used as the surprise. Also, when they announced about the surprise model, they said, "We have pulled out all the stops for this year's surprise model." The phrase pulling out all the stops could possibly, maybe, be related to stock horses, since reining horses are known for those sliding stops. And yeah, it's a little bit of a reach, I get it. Pulling out all the stops could mean nothing in terms of the breed type this mold will be, but it's still fun to guess. Dundee is a popular mold and currently has a regular run model in production, which increases the chance of this mold being used. He was, however, used 3 times last year, which may hurt his chances of being used, or it may mean that Breyer really likes using him, so he has a higher chance of being used. I'm not too sure anymore, but the fact is this is a popular mold. Everyone, including Breyer, knows it, and honestly, it's hard not to love this mold. He is just amazing. Number 2. Bluegrass Bandit. I was very close to putting this model in the number 1 spot. However, the only thing that makes me a little hesitant is that she hasn't been in production for over a year. She was last used as a 2019 Tractor Supply exclusive, which is starting to get a little long for her to fit into that production pattern. She was, however, used as a live auction model in last year's BreyerFest, which means she is one of the few molds that fits into that live auction pattern. Overall, I could see this mold being used. She is a gorgeous mold, which I believe looks great in so many different colors. As I mentioned earlier, she is a special mold in that 2 artists worked on her, and that really could be a neat addition to the art-driven theme of BreyerFest this year. This model has also been done in clearwear 2 times before, so it would be neat to see her come back in clearwear again, possibly as a surprise model decorator. Now for my number 1 guess. Bobby Joe or the Working Cow Horse. I will say that Silver was actually my original number 1 guess, but since that web special of him came out, he got booted off the list and now Bobby Joe has taken his place. So why is this mare at the number 1 spot besides the fact that Silver got thrown out? Well, firstly, there is nothing pattern-wise that prevents her from being the surprise. She doesn't fit into that live auction pattern, but again, I wonder if there were some models that were going to be in the live auction last year that weren't, and maybe a Bobby Joe mold was one of those models. I originally almost wasn't going to put her this high up on the list because of the fact that the most recent release on her was a rainbow decorator, which is very much the theme of this year's BreyerFest. But the Andalusian Stallion also had his last release be a rainbow decorator in 2018 before he became the surprise in 2019. So maybe they'll be doing the same thing again here. Unless, of course, that's just too obvious. Maybe it is too obvious for them to do the same thing they did with the surprise in 2019. But I don't know, maybe, maybe not. This mare does have the benefit of being a popular mold. Plus, she is a stock horse. That again fits that pulling out all the stops motto. It's not a repeat of the breed type last year. And there isn't a huge amount of stock horse representation in this year's BreyerFest. Although I don't think that last part really matters too much. From what I've noticed from looking at different BreyerFest patterns, the breed type of the model isn't really affected by what other breed types are used for that BreyerFest. But whatever the case, it is still something, I guess. I could really see Bobby Joe being the surprise. She kind of feels artsy. I actually oddly think of her tail, kind of looks like a paintbrush for some reason. I just thought of that when I looked at her as Spectrum. It's like her tail is a paintbrush with a little bit of paint on the end of it, and she is whooping around to flick that paint onto a canvas. Kind of like Jackson Pollock. Speaking of Pollock, I didn't mention this in the color section of the video, but since Pollock is a Rainbow Decorator special run model this year, I think it is very unlikely that the surprise decorator, if there is one, would be a rainbow colored model too. So even though Bobby Joe was recently released as a Rainbow Decorator, if she is the surprise and there's a decorator of her, we likely won't see her in rainbow colors like this again. There's my top guesses for you guys. It seriously was very hard to do this list this year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say I've put several hours into debating what molds to pick and what order to put them in this list. There are just so many different factors that come into play here in trying to figure out what the surprise model could be. This is also a strange year because it is really early for me to do this video. Any upcoming Breyer releases, like BreyerFest models that they haven't shown yet, or mid-year releases and web specials that come out between now and BreyerFest, very well could affect my list of the top 10 guesses. If several models do come out that drastically change my list of guesses, as I mentioned earlier, I will do an updated Surprise Horse Speculation video closer to BreyerFest to go over what has changed. But now's the time I turn it over to you guys. What do you think the BreyerFest 7 Arts Surprise model is going to be? What colors do you think they'll do for it? What is your top mold guess? Let me know down in the comments below. Thank you again to the channel Bend, Break, and Recreate for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check out their channel and videos for some customizing fun. Thank you for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye everyone!